Hi students, in this video we are going to discuss about application and scope of the non-parametric test. So, in this session we will be discussing about when to use the non-parametric test and when to use the parametric test under what kind of data. Then we will be discussing about the advantages and disadvantages of the non-parametric test. So, when to use which non-parametric test, that is the biggest confusion, and every people will be coming to know about, like, we know when to use the parametric test, but we do not know like which kind of non-parametric test we should use it. So, we can see from this table, we can see like what is the nature of the sample and what is the different level of measurements and what type of test we are going to use it. So, we can see here parametric and non-parametric, and in this parametric we will be having like whether it should be interval or ratio. Same way in non-parametric we will be having interval or ratio, and for the categorical data we will be having nominal or ordinal. So, first we can discuss about one sample. So, for if we have one sample, so in the case of parametric and if your data is interval, then we can use either Z test or T test, but in case of non-parametric we can use sign test. If it is the data is a nominal or ordinal, then we can use the binomial test. Then we can move on to the two sample. In two sample we will be having two kind of level of measurements, one is independent, the other one is dependent. So, in the case of parametric, if it is the interval data, then we can use the independent sample t test, and if it is dependent, that is matched sample, right. So, in that case we will be having paired sample t test. In the case of non-parametric, we will be using, instead of independent sample t test, we will be using Matt-Whitney test when the data is interval. If the data is nominal, then we can use the chi-square test. Then we can move on to the dependent. For parametric it will be paired sample t test, and for the non-parametric it will be like Wilcoxon sign rank test. And if the data is nominal, then we will be using McNamara test, which is not included in this part. Then we will be moving on to the k samples, that is more than 2 groups, right, more than 2 samples we will be having same way like independent and dependent. So, if your level of measurement is independent and if you are trying to use parametric test, then we can use the one way ANOVA, and if the data is dependent, that is paired one, and if it is more than 2 groups, and then we can use parametric test, that is repeated measures ANOVA. We already know like for one way ANOVA the alternative is Kruskal values in the case of non-parametric, and for the repeated measures ANOVA we will be adding Friedman test, which is an alternative to the repeated measures ANOVA. Okay. So, in both the cases we will be using, if the data is nominal and if we have more than 2 samples, then we have to use the chi-square test. If we are going to do with the dependent variable, that is dependent level of measurement, and if the data is nominal, then we can use the Cochran's Q test. Now, we can discuss about what are all the advantages of non-parametric test. Probability statement obtained from most non-parametric statistics are exact probabilities regardless of what kind of shape of the population distribution may be from which the random sample was drawn. If the sample size are small, for example as n equal to 6 are used, there is no alternative to use the non-parametric test. Computations are easy to learn and results are very much easier to understand. Based on this model that specifies very general conditions regarding the non-parametric test. No specific form of the distribution from which the sample is drawn. So, from these points we can easily understand like if your sample size is very much small and even if you do not know what is the shape of the distribution, still we can use the non-parametric test, and it is very easy to use it and it is very simple to obtain the result. So, now we can discuss about disadvantages of non-parametric test. It is very less powerful than parametric test, use less information than parametric test, less efficient because the large sample size or need to defect significant result. Due to its simplicity, it may also lead to the improper use and misinterpretation. So, from this point we can easily understand like parametric test is more powerful than the non-parametric test, but the non-parametric test will be more useful when we come across the small sample. Second thing is like it will be using only less information. The reason behind is like in parametric test we will be using the original observation, in non-parametric test we will be using the rank of those observations. So, we will be losing certain information. So, from this point we can easily understand like parametric test little bit more powerful than the non-parametric test. So, at last, so if you use non-parametric test in the place where parametric test could be appropriate, it will be having only less power, that is the validity of the result will be very much less in compared to the significance. So far in this session we have discussed about what is mean by non-parametric test, the definition of the non-parametric test, then we have discussed about the difference between the distribution free and non-parametric, and at last we have discussed about the when to use the non-parametric test in the first part. The second part we have discussed about like what is the difference between the parametric and non-parametric test and when to use both the tests under what situation, and at last we have discussed about like the application and scope of the non-parametric. In that we have discussed about the advantages and disadvantages of the non-parametric test. So, in the upcoming video we will be discussing about the different methodology involved in the non-parametric test. Thank you.